A billionaire trusted machines, engineers, and his own empire, until a little girl's whisper saved his life. What she saw, that no one else did, exposed a conspiracy inside his own tower. Ethan Vale stood tall in the marble lobby, his reflection caught in the mirrored walls that gleamed around him, his watch flashing as it reminded him he was already late for the most important board meeting of the quarter. He adjusted his tie, the silk smooth beneath his fingers, and pressed the elevator button, expecting it to glide open like everything else in his carefully built life. He was used to precision, to things moving exactly as he designed them. His buildings rose across the city skyline, and with every floor he added, his empire grew stronger, louder, more undeniable. Today was supposed to be another victory, the final signatures on a project worth hundreds of millions, a new tower that would bear his name for generations. He thought only of the contracts in his briefcase and the waiting men in tailored suits, all hungry for his word. Around him, the lobby buzzed with students on a school field trip, their voices echoing off glass and steel, their teachers trying to herd them into neat lines, their sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. Ethan barely noticed them, except as background noise. Children had no place in his world of deadlines and boardrooms, and he brushed past with the polite distance of someone who believed his time was worth more than theirs. Yet one child stepped out of line, a small girl with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, eyes too sharp for her age, her little backpack hanging off one shoulder. She moved with quiet certainty, not the nervous energy of the others, and before Ethan could turn away, she reached for his arm. The touch startled him, soft but firm, her small hand gripping his sleeve with surprising strength. He looked down, ready to gently push her back toward her group, but her eyes locked on his, steady, urgent, unblinking. In a voice barely louder than a breath, she whispered, "Not that one." Her words hung in the air heavier than they should have, carrying a weight he could not explain. For a moment he froze, his finger still hovering near the glowing elevator button, and he frowned, wondering if she was playing some childish game. The elevator chimed, its doors sliding open with smooth precision, revealing a polished box lined with brass trim. Executives already stepping inside, their briefcases clutched, their phones buzzing, their voices brisk with impatience. One of them called out, "Ethan, let's move. We are running late." He should have stepped forward. He should have brushed aside the nonsense of a child. Yet he found himself rooted in place, staring at the girl, her hand still on his sleeve, her gaze unwavering, her lips pressed tight, as if holding back more than she dared say. In that pause, seconds stretched long. Ethan's heartbeat quickened, not from fear, but from something stranger, the realization that he, a man who trusted logic above all, was hesitating because of a child's whisper. The elevator doors began to close, and at the last moment he stepped back, pulling free from her hand but not entering. The doors sealed, the bell chimed again, and the world continued. Yet something in his chest felt changed. He turned to ask the girl why, but the words caught in his throat, and the hum of the rising elevator faded above them. Ethan shifted his weight and forced a small smile, deciding to humor the child, though he felt ridiculous for doing so. His colleagues filing past him into the polished brass interior of the elevator, their voices sharp with impatience, as they spoke of numbers and contracts, none of them noticing the small girl who still lingered by his side. He told himself it was nothing, that stepping back was only a matter of seconds lost, but deep inside, he felt the faintest tremor of unease, a ripple across the calm surface of his certainty, and he stayed rooted in place as the doors began to close. The last thing he saw was his chief financial officer adjusting his cufflinks, another director tapping at his phone, their faces tired but expectant, men who trusted the machinery of the building as much as they trusted him. The doors sealed, the bell chimed, and Ethan turned away, shaking his head at his own foolish hesitation, already preparing to take the next car up. The sound came first, a metallic groan that seemed to vibrate through the marble floor beneath his feet. Then, A sudden alarm shrieked, piercing the hum of the lobby, and gasps echoed as the panel above the elevator flashed red. Ethan's breath caught in his chest as the building shuddered, and in the span of a heartbeat, he understood that something was terribly wrong. The girl beside him clutched her backpack tightly, her dark eyes wide but calm in a way no child should ever be. And before he could move, the screams began. The elevator cables wailed, a grinding howl that rose and broke as the car plummeted, vanishing into the shaft with a force that made the air shift around them, followed by a crash so violent it seemed to shake the bones of the building itself. Silence fell in the aftermath, broken only by the faint hiss of smoke curling from the panel, the sharp wails of alarms, and the horrified cries of the school children gathered nearby, their teachers struggling to shield their eyes from what could not be unseen. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face, his legs weak beneath him, the reality of what had just happened slamming into him with merciless weight. 2 board members, men he had known for years, had been in that elevator, alive and breathing only moments ago, now gone in an instant. His stomach turned, his hands shook, and yet one truth pierced through the chaos like a blade. He should have been with them. He turned slowly toward the girl, the stranger who had grabbed his arm, the child who had whispered words he almost ignored, and for the first time in his life, Ethan Vale felt the fragile thread that separated control from collapse. Her gaze met his, steady, unflinching, as if she had known all along, and he could not bring himself to look away. In that moment, he realized, with chilling clarity, that his life, his empire, and everything he believed unshakable had just been saved by the warning of an 8-year-old. Ethan sat in the corner of the lobby, his body still tense from the shock, his mind trying and failing to make sense of the disaster that had unfolded only minutes earlier. The building's alarms had been silenced now, but the echo of them seemed to live in his chest, and the distant sound of emergency crews moving through the lower levels reminded him of what he had narrowly escaped. He ran a hand across his face, feeling sweat on his brow despite the cool air, and when he finally looked up, his gaze landed on the girl who had stopped him, standing apart from the noisy crowd of students, her small frame still and watchful. Something in her calm unsettled him more than the chaos around them, and before he could change his mind, he motioned for her to come closer. She approached without hesitation, clutching her backpack to her chest as if it were a shield, her dark eyes meeting his with a steadiness that seemed far too old for 8 years. Ethan leaned forward, his voice quieter than he intended, and asked why she had stopped him, why she had whispered with such certainty. For a moment she didn't answer, as though weighing whether he would actually listen. Then she spoke in the same calm tone she had used before. She said she had noticed the elevator making a sound it should not have, a faint grinding that grew sharper when the doors opened. And she said she had smelled something strange too, like wires burning behind the walls. Her voice carried no drama, no attempt to impress him, only the plain truth of what she had sensed. Ethan felt the hairs rise on his arms, because he had noticed nothing, not a sound, not a smell, and yet she had, and that difference had saved his life. He pressed her gently, asking how she could be so certain, and she shrugged, saying that in the places she had lived before she had learned to pay attention, that sometimes the only way to stay safe was to notice things others ignored. Her words were simple, but they hit him harder than any lecture, and for the first time he truly looked at her, at the way her eyes scanned the room, at the way her fingers traced the seams of her backpack, at the way she carried herself with quiet awareness. The lobby bustled with frightened tenants and officials, but in that small circle of conversation, everything else fell away. Ethan realized he was listening to someone who saw more than the world wanted her to, and he felt both humbled and unsettled. He had built towers of glass and steel. He had trusted engineers and experts, yet none of them had noticed what this girl had sensed in seconds. He thanked her, his voice rough, but she only gave the faintest nod, as if saving a life were not extraordinary, but simply what one did when paying attention. The lobby had settled into a hushed unease, tenants whispering in clusters while investigators moved briskly with clipboards and radios, their sharp voices echoing off the marble. Hours had passed since the elevator's plunge, yet the smell of smoke and oil lingered faintly in the air, a reminder of how close death had crept to the polished heart of Ethan's empire. He stood near the cordoned area, jacket draped over his arm, listening as the chief investigator announced that the likely cause was a mechanical failure, a worn cable, a tragic but ordinary accident. The words rolled over Ethan without sinking in, his mind still replaying the crash and the small hand that had pulled him back. He nodded absently, signed forms, gave statements, but beneath the surface, his thoughts tangled in restless circles. Sophie lingered at the edge of the scene, her teacher urging her back to the group of children, but she broke away once more, slipping through the line of suited men until she was beside Ethan. He looked down, surprised by her quiet persistence, and saw the same steady gaze that had stopped him earlier. She told him plainly that she had seen something no one else had mentioned. A man crouched near the panel beside the elevator earlier that morning, his hand moving quickly with tools before disappearing into the stairwell. Her voice was soft but sure, and she described him in fragments: dark jacket, cap pulled low, movements too practiced to belong to a janitor. Ethan felt a flicker of irritation rise, the instinctive pushback of a man whose day had already been broken apart. He thanked her politely, told her it was likely just maintenance staff, and turned away, convincing himself that trauma made children imagine details. Yet her words clung stubbornly as the hours passed, replaying with sharper edges in his mind, until finally he called for security to pull the surveillance tapes from the morning. In the dim light of the control room, Ethan stood with folded arms, eyes locked on the grainy footage as the cameras rolled. There, at precisely the time Sophie had said, a figure in a dark jacket knelt at the panel, glancing over his shoulder before working quickly with a small device. The camera caught only the edge of his face before he vanished into the stairwell. But it was enough. The official reports said mechanical failure, but the truth flickered across the screen in undeniable clarity. Ethan's chest tightened, a chill running down his spine as the implications grew heavier. This was no accident, no worn cable, but something deliberate. And the only reason he knew was because an 8-year-old girl had seen what he had dismissed. He leaned closer to the monitor, his reflection merging with the blurred image of the saboteur, and for the first time he felt the shadow of something larger pressing against his world, a threat that moved unseen through the spaces he thought he controlled. Ethan sat behind his vast glass desk, the city skyline stretching like a crown of steel and light beyond the windows. Yet he felt no pride in it, only the gnawing weight of guilt pressing heavier with each passing hour. He had built towers that touched the clouds. He had orchestrated deals worth fortunes. He had convinced himself he was a man who saw further than others, yet it had taken a child's whisper to save his life. The investigators had already closed their files with the convenient phrase mechanical failure, but Ethan knew better, because Sophie had been right, and he had nearly brushed her aside. That knowledge burned him with quiet shame, so he called her back. The next afternoon, Sophie walked into his office, holding the hand of her foster guardian, a woman named Mrs. Turner, whose lined face carried both weariness and kindness, her clothes plain but neat, her tone respectful as she apologized for any trouble the girl might have caused. Ethan rose to greet them, his voice unusually soft, as he explained that Sophie had in fact prevented a disaster and that he wanted to thank her properly. He gestured toward the tray of juice and cookies laid out by his assistant, trying to create a space that felt less intimidating. But Sophie did not sit like the children he had seen at board members' parties. She perched on the edge of the chair, her backpack still strapped to her shoulders, her brown eyes sharp and restless as they scanned the room. Ethan told Mrs. Turner he would be covering Sophie's school tuition for the next year, that he would provide laptops, tutors, anything she needed, framing it as an act of gratitude, Yet the woman's startled expression made him feel the inadequacy of such gestures. Sophie said nothing at first, sipping her juice quietly, until Ethan finally asked if she was all right. That was when she lifted her gaze and cut through him with a question that landed like a blade. Why, she asked, did he ignore the obvious warnings in his own building? Why did it take her to see what he and his people had missed? The words hung heavy in the air, not insolent, but honest, too honest. And Ethan felt the sting of them more than any accusation he had ever faced in the boardroom. He tried to answer, speaking of trust in his engineers, of schedules too full to notice details, of systems meant to prevent such dangers. But Sophie only tilted her head slightly, unconvinced, and her silence pressed harder than any rebuttal. He realized she was not impressed by wealth or power. She was measuring him against something simpler, whether he truly paid attention, whether he cared enough to see. The unease unsettled him, for he had never been judged in such a way. Mrs. Turner thanked him again and rose to leave, but Ethan found himself reluctant to let them go, torn by the strange pull of a child who had forced him to confront the blind spots in his carefully ordered world. Valerie arrived at Ethan's penthouse the evening after the accident, her heels clicking against the marble floor, her perfume filling the air like a carefully chosen signature. She carried herself with effortless grace, the kind that drew every eye in a room, her blonde hair gleaming under the soft lights, her smile polished and warm. She wrapped her arms around Ethan as if nothing in the world could shake her calm, and told him firmly that the elevator disaster was nothing more than bad luck, a random failure of metal and wires, nothing to torture himself over. Her voice was soothing, confident, the same voice she used when persuading investors at charity galas. And Ethan wanted to believe her, wanted to let the weight slip from his shoulders and vanish. They sat together on the leather sofa, the skyline stretching wide beyond the glass walls, and she poured wine with the practiced ease of someone who understood the value of atmosphere. She reminded him that his empire was built on order and numbers, not on shadows and suspicions, that sometimes accidents simply happened, and that worrying too much would only distract him from what truly mattered. She pressed a hand against his chest and smiled, her green eyes gleaming as she shifted the conversation toward the billion-dollar redevelopment deal waiting on his desk, the one she had urged him to finalize for weeks. It was the kind of project that would define his legacy, she said, the crown jewel of his career, the victory that would silence doubters and rivals. Ethan listened, half comforted, half unsettled, because her certainty came too easily, as though she had rehearsed each word. He tried to silence the flicker of unease by reminding himself of her loyalty, of the nights she stayed by his side during long negotiations, of the way she seemed to understand his ambitions better than anyone. Yet in the back of his mind he saw Sophie's eyes, dark and unyielding, when she had told him not to ignore what was right in front of him. Sophie had not smiled. Sophie had not softened her words. She had simply spoken the truth she saw. When Sophie visited the office again with her foster guardian to thank Ethan for his help, Valerie appeared in the doorway, her presence radiant, her voice smooth as she greeted the child with practiced sweetness. But Sophie's posture stiffened, her gaze narrowing with a quiet distrust that needed no explanation. Later, when they were alone, Sophie told Ethan that she did not like Valerie, that her smile did not reach her eyes, that something about her felt wrong. Ethan laughed gently and told her she was being unfair, that Valerie only wanted the best for them all. He dismissed the doubts as childish jealousy, unwilling to let suspicion stain the comfort Valerie offered. Yet as he returned to his desk, the contract papers waiting, Ethan could not shake the odd dissonance between the fiancée who soothed him with charm and the child who unsettled him with unfiltered honesty. The lobby of Vale Tower was built to impress, tall ceilings glimmering with chandeliers, marble floors polished until they shone like still water, and walls lined with art that spoke of wealth and certainty. To the executives and tenants who passed through, it was a place that inspired confidence, a fortress of order. But to Sophie, sitting quietly on a bench while Mrs. Turner filled out paperwork at the reception desk, the grand lobby was not only beautiful, it was alive with small details that whispered stories most people never stopped to hear. She swung her legs gently, her backpack balanced on her lap, and let her eyes wander with the patient attention that had saved her once already. She noticed a fire door on the west wall, meant to remain closed at all times, standing slightly ajar with a strip of clear tape holding the latch back. A janitor passed by without a glance. An executive swiped his card at the main turnstile, and not one of them seemed to care. Sophie stared longer, her small brow furrowing, then quietly pulled out the notebook she carried everywhere, the one filled with her restless sketches and notes. She drew the shape of the door, the faint glimmer of tape across the metal, and added a short line of words, "Door taped open." She shaded it carefully so she would remember exactly how it looked. Her gaze moved again, this time to the ceiling vents that lined the hallway leading to the elevators. One of them rattled faintly, a steady hum that did not match the others. She tilted her head, listening, catching the difference in tone, the faint throb of machinery that seemed out of place. She sniffed the air and thought she caught the faintest tang of ozone, like wires buzzing too hot. Again her pencil scratched across the page, a drawing of the vent, a note that said, "Humming strange." She underlined the words twice, her small handwriting neat and precise. She kept watching, unnoticed by the busy stream of adults who assumed she was simply passing the time with childish doodles. Her teacher scolded another child for running. The receptionist smiled politely at Mrs. Turner. The security guard checked his phone, and still Sophie filled her notebook with what no one else seemed to see. She drew the security camera above the revolving doors and wrote that it blinked unevenly. She drew the janitor's cart left too close to an emergency exit. She drew the faint dark smudge near the elevator panel where someone's hands had lingered too long. By the time Mrs. Turner returned, Sophie had several new pages filled with quick sketches, details caught in lines, and words that no one had asked her to make. She closed the notebook before anyone could glance inside, slipped the pencil back in its place, and tightened the straps on her backpack. No one asked her what she had been doing. No one leaned down to see her careful record of the building's secrets, but Sophie carried it silently, a map of warnings in a world that refused to look. Josephine Chen had worked beside Ethan for more than a decade, long enough to know the rhythm of his empire, long enough to know that behind the glass walls and polished floors there were always cracks waiting to spread. At 67, she had seen his father build fortunes and lose them. She had seen Ethan rise from an ambitious young man with restless eyes to the master of towers that bore his name, and she had learned to notice when the air around him shifted. On this quiet afternoon she passed through the lobby, carrying a folder of contracts, when she saw the small girl sitting alone on the bench, her pencil scratching across a notebook with the fierce concentration of someone twice her age. She might have walked past, but something in Sophie's expression made her pause, a seriousness that did not belong to a child waiting for her guardian. Later, when the girl left with Mrs. Turner, Josephine glanced at the bench and noticed the notebook left behind by mistake. She picked it up carefully, meaning to return it, but curiosity pulled her eyes downward, and what she saw made her stop cold. Page after page filled with neat sketches, fire doors with tape on the latches, vents marked with uneven humming, smudges near the elevator panel, cameras blinking wrong, every detail captured with precision. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned each page, because these were not the random doodles of a restless child. They were the same patterns Josephine herself had quietly worried over for weeks. She had dismissed them, afraid to sound paranoid, but here they were, laid out in a child's careful hand. She carried the notebook up to her office, closing the door behind her, and sat with it on her desk. The weight of it seemed heavier than paper should be. She remembered how she had found Valerie in the building at odd hours, how she had noticed Miles spending more time than usual near the engineering floor, how the fire drilled 2 weeks ago had been delayed because a door would not close properly. She had filed these things away as small concerns, unworthy of troubling Ethan, who was already carrying the weight of billion-dollar negotiations. But now, seeing Sophie's notes, she realized the pattern was not in her imagination. The girl had seen the same things, and more, and had been brave enough to record them without hesitation. Josephine closed her eyes, feeling the ache of years in her bones, and whispered to herself that this was no longer coincidence, that something deliberate was moving inside these walls. When Ethan returned that evening, she placed the notebook gently on his desk and told him he needed to read it. Her voice quiet but firm. He raised an eyebrow at first, but the seriousness in her eyes silenced his questions. For once she did not soften her words. She told him that the child saw the truth they had both been ignoring, and that if he did not act soon, the building he loved might turn against him from the inside. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the skyline glowing behind him as dusk painted the glass in streaks of gold and violet, and rubbed his temples, while Josephine stood firm across from him. Sophie's notebook spread open on the desk between them. He had listened patiently as Josephine explained her concerns, how the girl's drawings matched small oddities she herself had noticed, yet his instinct pushed back with the practiced resistance of a man used to solving problems through logic. Tape on a fire door, a vent that hummed, a blinking light, these were inconveniences at worst, not proof of sabotage. He closed the notebook with a careful hand and told them he appreciated their concern, but there was no reason to believe his building was under threat. His voice was calm, almost indulgent, the same tone he used when appeasing nervous investors. Sophie did not argue at first. She only sat quietly on the edge of the chair, her backpack against her knees, her sharp eyes roaming the room as if searching for something unseen. Josephine pressed harder, reminding him that he had nearly died in that elevator, reminding him that trusting the official report of mechanical failure was not enough. But Ethan shook his head, insisting that coincidence often felt like conspiracy when viewed too closely. The words tasted hollow even as he spoke them, but admitting otherwise would mean acknowledging how fragile his world had become. He rose from his chair, intending to end the discussion politely, when Sophie's voice cut through with the quiet precision of a blade. "That one blinks wrong," she said, pointing toward the ceiling corner above his desk. Ethan frowned, following her finger to the smoke detector mounted in the plaster. Its small red light pulsed steadily, no different than dozens of others throughout the tower. Yet as he stared, he realized she was right. The rhythm was off, the blink slightly irregular, faster than regulation. He narrowed his eyes, unease crawling into his chest, and before he could speak, Sophie added softly that she had been watching it for days, that the pattern was not connected to the building's safety system. Josephine climbed onto the chair, with surprising steadiness for her age, and twisted the casing loose, while Ethan steadied her. The cover came away with a snap, and what fell into Ethan's palm was not a standard smoke detector at all, but a sophisticated shell hiding a tiny lens and a transmitter no larger than a coin. His stomach dropped as the realization struck, because this was not cheap equipment bought from a store. This was custom technology designed for surveillance, and it had been installed in the heart of his office without his knowledge. He turned it over, watching the faint blue light flicker, proof that it was still transmitting, data flowing outward to a receiver somewhere beyond these walls. Silence pressed down on the room. Josephine's face hardened, Sophie's eyes shone with grim satisfaction, and Ethan felt the weight of his earlier dismissal crash against him. He had ignored them, he had doubted them, and now the truth pulsed in his hand, undeniable, a hidden eye stealing his secrets. Ethan carried the broken smoke detector into the executive wing the next morning, the tiny lens still glowing faintly in his palm like a wound that would not close. He walked straight into the office of Miles Wren, his chief financial officer, the man who had been with him since the first tower broke ground, the man he had once called his closest friend. Miles looked up from his desk, his easy smile already in place. the one that had soothed banks and persuaded investors for years. Ethan dropped the device onto the polished wood between them, the sound sharp as glass breaking, and demanded an explanation. Miles leaned back in his chair, hands folded loosely, insisting in calm tones that security breaches were inevitable in a building of this size, that someone had slipped past their protocols, and that he, personally, would see it handled. The words were smooth, confident, rehearsed, but Ethan noticed something that did not match the act. The fingers of his friend's right hand tapped the armrest in a restless rhythm. The skin at his temple glistened with the faint sheen of sweat. Sophie, standing quietly by the door because she had refused to be left behind, caught the detail first. She whispered to Josephine later that Miles's hands were shaking even as he smiled, that his calm was a costume, and that she did not trust him. Ethan tried to dismiss the thought, clinging to the years of loyalty and late nights spent building their empire together. Yet the unease settled in his chest like a weight. Josephine carried the suspicion with her long after the meeting ended. She had spent decades keeping accounts balanced and watching numbers speak truths that words often tried to hide. That evening, after Ethan had gone to dinner with Valerie, and Sophie had been taken home by her guardian, Josephine stayed late in the office. She opened the financial records Miles controlled, using the quiet authority that came from years of trust, and she followed the trails most men assumed invisible. What she found turned her stomach cold. 3 separate transfers, each disguised through layers of shell companies, each routed eventually to the same destination, Apex Holdings, a rival developer that had been circling Ethan's projects like a vulture for years. The sums were not enormous in the scope of billion-dollar deals, but they were large enough to speak of corruption, large enough to prove betrayal. Josephine sat in the glow of her monitor, her glasses sliding down her nose, her hands trembling not from age, but from anger. Miles Wren, the man Ethan believed unshakable, was feeding information to the very company most eager to see him fail. She closed the files carefully, printing nothing, saving nothing, only carrying the knowledge in her mind until she could place it directly before Ethan. She knew what it would do to him, the wound it would carve, but she also knew he had to see the truth, no matter how much it broke him. In silence, she turned off the light and locked the door, her reflection in the glass pale and stern, already preparing for the storm that would follow. Sophie had learned to move quietly, the way children in foster homes often did, slipping around adults who never really looked at them. And in Vale Tower, she discovered those same skills served her well. One afternoon, while Mrs. Turner spoke with the receptionist and Josephine prepared reports upstairs, Sophie wandered down a hallway she was not supposed to enter. The drafting room smelled faintly of ink and old paper, the hum of printers filling the air, the desks scattered with rulers and rolls of blueprints. She pushed the door softly until it clicked behind her and padded inside, her sneakers silent on the carpet. Her eyes roamed over the drawings pinned to the walls, tall towers sketched in clean lines, symbols she did not fully understand, yet studied with fascination. On a side table, a leather folder lay half open, and curiosity tugged at her. She slid it closer and opened it carefully, revealing sheets of plans that looked different from the others. The outlines of Vale Tower were familiar, but across the pages, someone had drawn red lines and circles, notations scrawled in hurried strokes. At first, she thought they might be safety upgrades, routes for alarms or reinforcements. But the more she looked, the less they made sense. The lines highlighted structural joints where the steel beams met, ventilation shafts that should remain clear, fire exits that had been altered. She remembered the taped door she had sketched in her notebook, the humming vent, and her stomach tightened. These were not fixes, they were weaknesses. Whoever had marked these blueprints had mapped the fragile bones of the building, planning how to break it from within. She flipped through more pages, each one worse than the last. Emergency stairwells marked with slashes, electrical panels circled with notes, elevator shafts underlined with heavy red ink. She did not understand all the symbols, but she understood intent. Someone wanted accidents to happen again, not by chance, but by design. Accidents that would look random, but would cripple Ethan's empire, piece by piece. Sophie's fingers clenched the pencil she carried, and she began sketching quickly in her notebook, copying what she saw before anyone could stop her. Her hand shook, but she forced the lines to be steady, recording the evidence in the only way she knew how. The sound of footsteps in the corridor made her heart race. She closed the folder quickly, slid it back exactly where it had been, and tucked her notebook deep into her backpack. When the door opened, she was sitting cross-legged on the floor, pretending to doodle, her face blank with the innocence of a child waiting for her guardian. The engineer who entered barely glanced at her before muttering about deadlines and gathering papers. Sophie slipped out while he was distracted, her heart pounding, her mind filled with images of red lines across blueprints. By the time she rejoined Mrs. Turner in the lobby, she wore her usual polite smile, but inside, she knew she carried a secret heavy enough to change everything. The building everyone trusted was already marked for ruin, and she was the only one who had seen the map. The boardroom glowed with amber light from the chandeliers. The table set not with spreadsheets and laptops, but with crystal glasses and silver plates, the illusion of intimacy, masking the tension that hummed beneath every word. Valerie sat beside Ethan, her hand brushing his arm, as she introduced the investors she had gathered. Men in tailored suits who spoke with smooth confidence, their eyes sharp as they glanced at the thick folder of contracts placed before him. She leaned close, whispering that this was the moment he had been waiting for, that all his worries could vanish if he simply signed and secured the billion-dollar redevelopment deal. Her smile was radiant, her voice velvet, and for a moment, Ethan let himself breathe in the ease she offered. Yet across the table, Sophie sat silently, a small presence, easily overlooked among the glitter of wealth and power. She had insisted on joining him, claiming she wanted to see what real meetings looked like, and Ethan, distracted, had allowed it. Now she watched with the same steady eyes that had once warned him of the elevator, her hands folded on her lap, her gaze fixed not on the investors but on the papers sliding toward Ethan. She noticed things the adults did not: the way one man tapped his pen too quickly, the faint smudge of correction fluid on the signature line, the corner of a page that had been replaced in haste. Her small fingers moved beneath the table, tugging a sheet from her notebook, and with a quiet bravery, she slipped it under Ethan's resting hand. He glanced down and saw her neat writing in pencil, 4 words that made his pulse quicken: "The papers are fake." His first instinct was to hide the note, to protect her from the scrutiny of the men at the table, but her eyes held him fast, urging him to trust what she saw. Valerie's voice flowed on, promising that with one stroke of a pen, his future would expand beyond even his dreams. But Ethan felt his pen grow heavy. He forced a smile, thanking the investors for their confidence, then leaned back and suggested that such an important deal deserved one more review, perhaps tomorrow, when his legal team could examine every page. Valerie's hand tightened on his arm, her nails pressing lightly, her smile faltering for just a second before she recovered, assuring everyone that, of course, Ethan was cautious, that it only proved his brilliance. The meeting ended with polite handshakes, but Ethan's chest burned with unease as he walked Sophie out into the night air. Later, in his office, Josephine laid fresh evidence before him, her voice grim. The contracts had indeed been doctored, clauses inserted that would strip Ethan of control and hand power quietly to Apex Holdings. Sophie's warning had spared him from signing away everything he had built. He sat in silence, staring at the papers that could have ended his empire, and then at the child who had once again seen what he had nearly missed. The tower was silent at midnight, its glass walls reflecting the city's restless lights, the hallways empty except for the hum of machines that never slept. Sophie lay awake in the guest room Josephine had prepared for her, staring at the ceiling, the shadows shifting as the air vents breathed. Something felt wrong. The kind of wrong that had pressed against her before the elevator crash. A hum in the walls that did not belong. When the faint hiss of sprinklers echoed through the vent above her bed, she sat up quickly, her heart pounding. Sprinklers did not run without fire. Yet there was no alarm, no smoke, only the sudden rush of water somewhere above. She slid from bed, pulled on her shoes, and hurried down the quiet corridor to Josephine's room. The older woman answered the knock within seconds, as if she too had not been sleeping deeply. Sophie explained in hushed words what she had heard, and Josephine, who had learned long ago to trust the child's instincts, grabbed her keyring and led the way to the service elevator. They rose to the 32nd floor, where the air was already damp and heavy, the ceiling tiles dripping with water that pattered onto the carpet. The emergency lights glowed faint red, and Sophie pointed toward the server room at the end of the hall, where smoke curled faintly from beneath the door. Josephine swiped her keycard and pushed the door open, and together they stepped into a storm. Water poured from the sprinklers in silver sheets, drenching the racks of servers, steam rising where circuits hissed and popped. Sophie coughed against the wet heat, her eyes stinging, but she pulled Josephine toward the central console, where lights still flickered. The heat was not from fire but from deliberate overload, wires twisted into forced loops, fans disconnected so the machines baked themselves from the inside. Someone had sabotaged the heart of Ethan's network, and the sprinklers had been triggered not to save, but to drown the evidence. Josephine's hands shook as she ripped free a drive still glowing with power, while Sophie shielded the tablet she carried under her jacket, recording everything with quick photos. They were soaked through, hair plastered, shoes squelching, but their determination was steady. The door burst open behind them, and Ethan appeared, his face white with panic at the sight of them in the flooded room. He rushed forward, pulling them toward the corridor, his voice sharp with fear as he demanded why they were there. Josephine thrust the dripping drive into his hands, her eyes blazing with a fire he had not seen in years, telling him that they had proof now, that this was no accident, that someone inside wanted his empire to collapse from the circuits upward. Sophie, shivering, lifted her notebook with water, warped pages, showing the sketches she had added in the storm, vents humming, doors taped, now a server room burned by design. Ethan looked at them, drenched and trembling but unbroken, and understood at last that the truth was drowning his tower from within. Ethan waited until the morning light poured over the city, his shirt still damp from the night before, the drive Josephine had saved resting on his desk like a loaded weapon. Valerie entered his office without knocking, her heels sharp against the floor, her smile bright, as if the world outside were untouched by disaster. She kissed his cheek lightly and asked if he had slept, her tone rich with concern, her hands warm on his shoulders. For a moment he almost let himself believe her, almost leaned into the comfort of her practiced presence. But the image of Sophie standing in the drenched server room returned to him and hardened his resolve. He placed the blackened drive on the table between them and asked directly if she knew anything about the sabotage on the 32nd floor. Her laugh was soft, melodic, the kind of laugh that usually disarmed him, but today it carried a thin crack he could not ignore. She called the incident a strange coincidence, said he was letting paranoia cloud his judgment, reminded him that stress had nearly killed his father and that he could not afford to follow the same path. Yet as she spoke, her smile wavered, her eyes flickering for an instant with something sharp and defensive before she lowered her lashes to hide it. Ethan felt the cold certainty grow in his chest that Sophie's doubts had not been childish after all. He pressed further, asking why she had arranged the investor dinner with contracts that Josephine later proved were false, why she had insisted so strongly on rushing the deal, why she always seemed to appear when sensitive meetings took place. Valerie's warmth thinned further, her voice harder now, claiming she had only wanted to help him, that any errors in the paperwork were the fault of careless assistance, that he was being unfair after all she had sacrificed. Ethan heard the edge of anger under her polished tone, And for the first time, he saw not the fiancée who soothed him, but a woman calculating her next move. While they spoke, Sophie lingered in the hallway, notebook pressed against her chest. She had learned long ago that truth often revealed itself in the moments adults believed themselves unobserved. She watched through the crack in the door as Valerie's phone lit up on the desk. Valerie turned slightly away, speaking in a voice low and hurried. But Sophie's ears caught the unfamiliar cadence of another language, words she could not translate but recognized as deliberate and secretive. She scribbled quickly in her notebook, noting the time, the tone, the sharpness in Valerie's voice. Josephine, standing beside Sophie, lifted her own phone and pressed record. The older woman had learned to trust not only her instincts, but Sophie's eyes, and she knew evidence mattered more than suspicion. The recording captured Valerie's hushed foreign words, proof that her mask had finally slipped. Ethan, watching Valerie's hands tremble as she ended the call, understood with sinking clarity that the woman he thought he loved was someone else entirely, someone who had stepped into his world, wearing a smile she never meant. The three of them gathered in Ethan's library that evening, the rain tapping steadily against the tall windows, the fire burning low but steady, its glow casting long shadows across the shelves. Sophie sat cross-legged on the rug with her notebook open. Josephine perched in the armchair with her glasses low on her nose, and Ethan stood near the mantel, staring at the blackened drive Josephine had saved from the server room. They spoke slowly at first, but as each detail surfaced, the picture sharpened into something darker than any of them had imagined. Josephine began by recounting the transfers she had traced, the hidden payments from Apex Holdings flowing into accounts, miles controlled, numbers that told a story of betrayal more clearly than words ever could. Ethan listened with his jaw tight, remembering late nights building their empire together, realizing now that every handshake might have concealed a knife. Sophie added her drawings one by one, laying them out on the carpet, pages filled with vents, fire doors, and the marked-up blueprints she had copied. Each sketch matched another piece Josephine had seen, each oddity tied back to the same pattern, deliberate weaknesses planted to create accidents that would appear random. Ethan bent down, running his hand across the pages, feeling the chill of understanding settle in. The elevator collapse, the overheating servers, the doctored contracts, none of it had been chance. Valerie's false warmth, Miles's easy smile, they were parts of the same design. Josephine's voice grew firm as she explained that Apex had every motive to see Vale Tower crumble. With Ethan's reputation damaged and his stock value plummeting, Apex could swoop in and seize his developments for a fraction of their worth, snapping up undervalued property and erasing a rival in one move. The sabotage was not reckless, it was calculated. A long game played with precision. Valerie had been introduced at just the right time, her beauty and charm distracting him from the dangers building inside his own walls. Her pressure on the billion-dollar redevelopment deal meant to push him into signing away control. Miles had been the inside man, feeding Apex every number, every schedule, every weakness, while Valerie pressed from the outside with affection and influence. Together they had turned his company into a chessboard, and he had been the piece they intended to topple. Ethan gripped the mantle, his knuckles white, his mind racing through memories that now looked different under the light of betrayal. Sophie watched him closely, her small face solemn, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm but certain. She told him that people like Valerie and Miles counted on men like him being too busy, too confident, too blind to see what was right before them, but that the truth was there if he chose to look. Josephine nodded, her expression steady, reminding him that the choice now was whether to remain the victim of their game or to turn the board in his favor. Ethan looked at both of them, his unlikely allies, and felt the anger inside him harden into resolve. The storm outside rattled the windows, but inside Ethan's study, the only sound was the scratch of Sophie's pencil across her notebook and the steady click of Josephine's keyboard as she pulled up financial records. Ethan stood at the center of the room, shoulders squared, watching them both with a mixture of awe and unease. For weeks he had dismissed Sophie's sharp eyes as the restless habits of a child. But now he saw her differently. Every note she had written, every sketch she had made, had led him to the truth, and without her he would already have been ruined. He admitted it quietly, the words catching in his throat, telling Sophie he trusted her, not just as a child to be protected, but as someone whose instincts had proven sharper than his own. Sophie looked up, her eyes bright with the rare warmth of being believed, and nodded, as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. They leaned together over the table, papers spread out, screens glowing with numbers. Josephine outlined the plan in precise terms. Apex wanted control of the redevelopment project. They wanted contracts that stripped Ethan of power, so he would give them exactly what they wanted. But the documents would be false, doctored to look genuine, yet hiding code that would track every move once Apex touched them. Ethan would provide the bait, but Sophie would weave in the trap, her small hands moving swiftly as she scribbled notes about how to disguise the malware, how to lace the files so they appeared flawless. Ethan asked her if she was certain, if she understood the risk, and she answered with calm certainty that they never noticed her anyway, that adults looked past children, and that was why she had to be part of it. The words hit him harder than he expected. She was right, they never noticed her, and that invisibility had become her greatest strength. He wanted to argue, to shield her, but Josephine placed a steady hand on his arm and reminded him that Sophie had already saved his life twice, that underestimating her now would dishonor the trust she had earned. So he let Sophie sit beside him at the computer, guiding her as she wove her code into the files, her small fingers quick on the keys, her face lit by the glow of the screen. Together they built a contract that looked perfect, every clause polished, every line sharp, yet hidden beneath its surface was a trail that would lead directly back to Apex, a trap dressed as opportunity. By the time the storm broke and the first light of dawn touched the skyline, the plan was complete. The decoy files were ready, encrypted, and laced with the invisible hooks that would capture everything once Apex reached for them. Ethan leaned back, exhaustion heavy but resolve sharper than ever, and looked at Sophie, who closed her notebook with a satisfied snap. She told him simply that now they would see who was really watching, and her voice carried the steady confidence of someone far older than her years. The anniversary of the collapse arrived with an uneasy silence, the tower gleaming in the morning sun as if nothing had ever gone wrong within its walls. Ethan walked through the lobby with measured steps, his thoughts heavy but clear. Sophie at his side with her notebook tucked safely under her arm, Josephine close behind carrying a folder filled with the evidence they had compiled. The building buzzed with the usual rhythm of executives and assistants, but beneath the surface ran a current of tension, as if the walls themselves waited for what was about to unfold. Valerie was already there, dressed in flawless white, her smile radiant as she greeted investors gathered for a commemorative ceremony. Miles stood near the elevators, his suit crisp, his voice warm, his expression calm, yet Ethan now saw the shadows behind his practiced ease. The crowd shifted as speeches concluded, and Miles gestured toward the central elevator, insisting that Ethan should ride up with him and Valerie to cut the ribbon on the renovated floor. The timing was perfect, too perfect, and Sophie felt the hairs rise on her arms. She tugged at Ethan's sleeve just as she had 1 year ago, her voice urgent but steady as she whispered, "Not that one." He froze mid-step, the memory of falling cables flashing through him, his chest tightening as he turned toward her. She pointed to the panel above the elevator doors, her sharp eyes catching the faint flicker of a tampered light, the hum beneath the machinery not matching the others. He trusted her without question this time and stepped back. Valerie's smile faltered, the first crack in her perfect mask, and Miles's hand twitched at his side. Josephine moved forward with deliberate calm, her phone already signaling the agents waiting nearby. In an instant, the lobby erupted with motion, federal officers pouring in through every entrance, voices commanding, hands raised, badges flashing, Valerie tried to step away, her voice sharp in protest, but two agents closed around her, pulling the phone from her clutch. Miles' smile collapsed entirely as another agent revealed the wires hidden in the elevator panel, proof of the trap they had prepared. The investors gasped, whispers rippled through the crowd, and cameras flashed as the two were handcuffed, their polished facades stripped in front of everyone they had hoped to deceive. Ethan stood motionless, his heart pounding, watching the people he had once trusted revealed as conspirators in broad daylight. Sophie's hand remained on his sleeve, her grip steady, her gaze calm, as if she had always known this moment would come. Josephine handed over the folder of transfers, contracts, and recordings. Sophie added her logs and sketches, and together the evidence painted a picture so clear no denial could blur it. As Valerie and Miles were led away, Ethan finally drew a long breath, the weight of betrayal lifting like a storm passing. The tower that had once nearly become his tomb now stood as the place where truth prevailed, because an 8-year-old had whispered the words that saved him again. Weeks later, the courtroom was quiet, except for the steady shuffle of papers and the soft voice of the judge reading the final decree. Ethan sat straight in his chair, his hands folded together but his chest tight with emotion he had not expected to feel so strongly. Beside him, Sophie swung her legs nervously, her backpack resting at her feet, her eyes darting from the judge to Ethan and back again, as if she still feared the decision could change. Josephine sat behind them, her hands folded calmly in her lap, her gaze steady and encouraging, a silent reminder that families were sometimes chosen in fire and trial, rather than born in comfort. When the words were spoken and the gavel struck, Sophie turned slowly, searching Ethan's face. And only when he nodded did she allow herself to smile, a smile that reached her eyes and filled the room. Back at the tower, Ethan led her into his office, the walls still gleaming but softer now, more lived in, less fortress and more home. On the far side, two new frames hung, one holding Josephine's old ledger, the one she had used to trace the transfers that exposed Miles, the other holding Sophie's notebook sketches, carefully copied onto fine paper so the pencil lines would never fade. Elevators, vents, fire doors, each small drawing that once felt like a child's distraction, now enshrined as the map that had saved them all. Sophie stood in front of them silently for a long time, her fingers brushing the glass, and whispered that she never thought anyone would care about what she noticed. Ethan told her gently that her eyes had seen what no one else dared, and that the company owed its survival to her. The weeks had not been easy. Reporters camped outside, shareholders demanded explanations, regulators pored over contracts. Yet through every meeting, Ethan carried himself differently, not as a man who believed control alone could protect him, but as a man who had learned the cost of blindness. He instituted new safeguards, teams trained to test every system, independent checks that could not be silenced, doors that could not be taped, servers that would never again be left to overheat. He spoke to his board not in numbers alone but in names, reminding them that safety was not just a line on a budget, but the difference between life and death. And each time he did, Sophie sat in the back of the room, watching, the quiet presence, who reminded him why he had changed. One evening, as the sun dropped low across the skyline, Ethan stood with her at the window. She asked if he remembered the first words she had spoken to him in that lobby, and he nodded, "Not that one." She told him softly that it was never only about the elevator. It was about learning to look, to notice, to listen. Ethan felt his throat tighten, because he understood now. She had not only saved his life, she had saved him from himself. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.